like to say hello to you that have joined us for the Revised Common Lectionary study on this Friday. One of the things that you will notice is that we are doing lessons this particular week from the Revised Common Lectionary, and our two lessons today are Romans 13, 8 through 14, and then Matthew 18, 15 through 20. Next week, we will go back to the International Lesson Series, and I can't remember what those texts are. You know what? I have a list. So next week, we will be talking about Mark 14, 27 through 42, if you would like to take a look at that. And the week after that, we will look at the last 9 verses of the Gospel of Mark that comes from chapter 16. I know that many of the people that join us for the Bible study on a weekly basis are overachievers, and I want to make sure that I give you the information that you need in order to overachieve. So we look at this text from Romans. We're winding down in Romans. It has 16 chapters to it, and we're in the middle of chapter 13. We begin at the 8th verse. And one of the things that you'll notice about these first few verses is that Paul is teaching things like Jesus taught them, but Paul does this in a more didactic way. He sounds like a school teacher in a way. He states things crisply and cleanly in this text anyway, and he tells people how to act. This part of the book of Romans, the first chapters of Romans, is mostly theology. It's theology of justification, then it moves to sanctification. In the early part, he talks about the salvation of the Jewish people. Paul covers the waterfront of theological issues. But then he gets to a point in chapter 12, and for several chapters, probably 3, he talks about the ethical part of what it means to be a believer. Sometimes scholars call this paranesis, which means ethical or moral teachings. So anyway, Paul begins by, he's been talking in the earliest part of chapter 13 about being subject to the authorities because they have been given their authority by God. This has come under some serious question, especially in the 20th century when you had people like Lenin, when you had people like Hitler, when you had people like Pol Pot in Cambodia. There were more people killed by their own governments in the 20th century than all the other centuries put together. So we made quite a name for ourselves in that way. So the business about being subject to authorities is, of course, always been put under question. But one of the reasons that Paul may have written it was people in the first century, during the time which the Bible was first written down and made more permanent through writing, was this idea that the end of the world or the eschaton was coming soon. And so that's why Paul would give recommendations to people that unless they could not control their lust, they should not get married because the time was short and they needed to get themselves ready for the consummation of the world by God. Of course, after 20th centuries, where Jesus has not returned yet, we can see that if nobody ever got married and nobody ever had children, that we would have a problem. There was a group back in the 1800s that believed that they should live exactly by the rule of the book of Revelation. And one of them, the people, there were two people that were leaders of the group. One's name was John Reeves, and the other one was a guy named Muggleton. And so the group got to be known as the Muggletonians. And in this particular group, it was like a cult or a commune, you might say. In this group, there was a strict rule that no one would ever get married, no one would ever have relations that might lead to children. And so basically, after a generation, the group died out because it could not repopulate itself. So anyway, here's Paul after talking about being subject to the authorities. Now he gives some other advice to this community in Rome, which he has not yet visited, but he is exercising some pastoral authority over them, and so he writes them this letter. Now he will eventually make it to Rome, but to this point he is not. He writes, "Owe no one anything except to love one another." What he's saying here is don't be in debt to other people. That's a bad way to go through life. He says, except to love one another, which is something that Jesus said often. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And of course, the law is love your neighbor as yourself. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a very important thing for people to note. It's something that Jesus said. It's something that Paul wrote. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. You'll remember that some of the people that Paul is writing to are Jewish Christians. Some are Gentile Christians. So when he says love is the fulfilling of the law, he is nodding to the Jewish Christians that are worried or anxious about fulfilling the ritual law of Moses, that if they love one another as Jesus has said to both Jews and Gentiles, then they will fulfill the law. And then he says, besides this, you know what time it is. That is a direct reference to the eschaton, or the last days. Yom Yahweh is what Amos calls it. You know what time it is now. It's late in the game. How it is now the moment for you to wake from your sleep. A few weeks ago, we talked about Jesus telling the disciples to look alive, be alert, wake up, do not go to sleep. This is the same sort of counsel that Paul is giving. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first became believers. That's something of a tautology, because whatever happens at the end of our lives, we are closer to that than we were yesterday or the day before. And then he says, let us lay aside every work of darkness, put away and put on the armor of light. Darkness is a metaphor in the New Testament for evil or bad things. When Judas betrays Jesus, John puts this cryptic sentence at the end of that story. He said, and it was night. And so here Paul is saying, put aside the works of darkness, which would be evil, nasty, wicked things, and put on the armor of light. The armor of light would be the armor of truth and beauty and so forth. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. In other words, be people of the light, don't be people of the dark. If you look at those things that he says put away, which are in verse 13, you'll notice that we think of most of those things as happening in the darkness. Now, one last thing I want to say about this particular text is that when Augustine was in a garden in Milan, he heard a voice over a wall that was surrounding the garden that he and one of his friends were in. And the voice said, "Take up and read, take up and read. Tolle, tolle, lege, lege." I believe that is in Latin. And what Augustine did was he flipped open the Bible, he put his finger on a text, and what it said was, "Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provisions for the flesh to gratify its desires." And in that verse, according to Augustine's Confessions, he was converted to Christ. He had some time to sort of come to terms with what exactly all that meant, but that verse was the turning point in really in the history of Christianity in some ways, because you can draw almost a direct line between Paul and Augustine and Luther and Wesley and Karl Barth. Those were great theologians that all talked a lot about justification by faith, that God declares us not guilty. And so I just thought I would point that out to you because I think it's an interesting verse, and it has a lot to do with the history of Christianity. Now I'd like to invite you to turn back in your New Testament to chapter 18 of Matthew, and this will be verses 15 through 20. This is a very well-known section of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is really the only gospel that talks about the church as an institution, a congregation, an assembly, something like that. And that's what this text is about. It's about how do we deal with conflict as it occurs in our worshiping community. And so he says, this is Jesus speaking, and he is talking to the disciples. He says, if another member of the church, and that could also be if your brother, but it really means something larger. If another member of the church, the ecclesia, sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. This happens all the time. I know that people come to me from time to time and they will say things like, well, you know, everyone is saying this or that. And I'll say, well, who's saying that? Well, I can't tell you. It's just everyone. And then I'll say, well, can you tell those people to call me? Oh, no, they'd be too embarrassed to call you. This is not a helpful way to deal with conflict, to get a third party involved. It's called triangulation. And the way this works is, here's combatant number one. Let's say it's a daughter-in-law. Here's combatant number two, which is the mother-in-law. And so instead of these two dealing with each other straight one to another to clear the air and to communicate, what they do is get a third party involved, which would be a yoga instructor or something like that. And what you see here is what's called triangulation. And triangulation means we always get a third party involved in a conflict that happens between two people. Jesus is very wise here. He says, if you have a problem with somebody in the church, if you think that somebody in the church has sinned against you, or you have sinned against them, then go to that person and you two work it out unilaterally between you two. Don't drag some third party into it. Jesus was very smart about this kind of stuff because you remember the two brothers that came, and one asked Jesus, please judge between my brother and me. And Jesus said, who set me up as a judge over you? Jesus thinks that people need to deal with their issues with each other. That's step number one. It's the most important one. In fact, the people in the church, instead of, I don't like my Sunday school teacher, so I tell 6 other people in the class that I don't like them, instead go to the teacher and say, this bothers me when you do this, or whatever, straight, one-on-one. That's what Jesus is talking about. But if it fails, or Jesus says at least, if the member listens to you, you have regained that one. In other words, what do you have to lose by going to that person one-on-one? You can probably fix the problem, and you probably should. Who wants to involve a bunch of innocent bystanders in a 2-person fight? Okay? Then he says, but if you are not listened to, in other words, if it doesn't work, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Instead of somebody just making something up, that you would have 2 or 3 other people that would say, this is what was said, this is what I understand happened, and this is the way that it should turn out. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the whole church, the whole assembly, the whole congregation. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 or of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among you. Now, for a long time, I thought this was just the greatest sort of text in the world. It gave me permission that if I went to one of my enemies one-on-one, and that didn't work, and if I took 2 or 3 other neutral witnesses even to that person, they wouldn't listen to them, and I took it to the whole church and said that, then I could treat that person as a sinner and a tax collector, a Gentile or tax collector, which would have been the enemies of these people. And one day, as I was kind of fiddling around reading the New Testament, I realized that when Jesus said treat them as a Gentile and tax collector, I thought back about all the times that Jesus had encounters with Gentiles and tax collectors. And I recognized that when Jesus said treat them that way, perhaps he was recommending that we treat them the way that he treated them, which was to forgive them, open his arms, and welcome them back into the fold. That ought to give you something to think about this Labor Day weekend. And I would like to say that I deeply appreciate you being here, and I will see you again next week. Thank you.